All right, so you're probably tired of all the preamble now, and you're ready to just get into modeling this asset. So now, unfortunately, before we do exactly that, we do want to do a little bit more setup. And that's going to be setting up our reference images. Generally, when we work with models, we don't want to model it just from our memory alone. And we're going to need to use some kind of concepts or reference to help guide us along the creation process. So in my 3D viewport, I'm going to hit Shift A and go down to Image and Reference. And this is going to allow us to select a reference image here. Now make sure that under our resources folder, we're going to want to select the tread patterns PNG. And just make sure that align to view is checked off so that it's not trying to align it in our 3D view when we bring it in. And we can go ahead and load that. So with this image, I just want to make sure that it's rotated vertically so that we can go ahead and see it up and down when we look from the front orthographic. I'm going to bring it back on the Y a little bit, so hitting G and then Y to bring it back a couple different spaces back here so it's not intersecting with the tire as we start modeling it. And then if I go into front orthographic and I go into our image data properties over here, I want to decrease the opacity, so from 1 to 0.7, so we can start to see some of those grid lines through the image. And I also want to scale this by hitting S upwards to match the 2-meter radius. So we can see, hopefully on your screen, that we've got these big squares here. And each one of these is going to be a meter big. So I want to go and line our tire tread up so that it just hits those solid lines there. And again, we might have to move it a little bit. These tire guides aren't exactly perfect, but we're not going to need them to be, just close enough to give us the general idea. So now I'm going to create a new empty to just slot that into. And if I double click, we can call this something like ref, and we'll just drag and drop this empty image into there. Awesome. So now we can go ahead and start creating our really cool high poly tread model. Let's go and create a new collection here. And I'll call this one high poly. And I'll even right click on it and give it a pretty cool like yellow color. So let's make sure that our origin is in the center of our scene by hitting Shift S, and then I'll select cursor to world origin so that it's all zeroed out. And in our high poly collection here, let's go and Shift A to add a mesh plane. And this is how we're going to start our modeling. So if I hit Tab to go into edit mode, and then I hit M to merge all of these vertices at center, this is going to allow us to effectively just create one single vert, which if I go into front orthographic view, is going to be the basis or the origin of this model here. Now, before we get too far, I want to kind of explain how we're going to be tackling this model, because it's going to be a lot less work than I think maybe it initially looks like. So what we're going to be doing is on these guides here, we're going to try and find one small slice of our tread pattern here that we can create manually, but can also be recreated procedurally once we start to use some of the modifiers that Blender has to non-destructively create the extra areas of this tire. So we aren't going to have to create all of these tread patterns by hand, and instead if we can just create one slice of it, we can go ahead and start to use an array modifier and a curve modifier to really create the complexities of the tire so that we don't have to do all of that by hand, and we can do a couple of manual tweaks kind of towards the end of modeling it just to make sure that it looks exactly perfect. So with this single vertex, what I'll do is I'll hit E to extrude it, and I'm going to constrain that to the Z axis. So I'll hit Z to bring that down. And then if I go and select both of these, I'll hit E to extrude them again, and this is going to create our very first face. Now I'll go ahead and just extrude this out to the other side as well. And just an FYI for these references here, again, we're going to want to make sure we're following the black areas as kind of like the extrusions of the face of the tread, whereas the white areas are going to be more impressions into the tread, areas that are a little bit more hidden or are cavities of our tread pattern. So to finish off our little slice here, let's go and select this edge. I'm going to hit E to extrude again. Remember, because we still have to model out this area, it's just going to be more of like an indentation. And then E once more and twice more. And so that's finished out that side there. Now if I do the same exact thing over here, I'll hit E to extrude this out. And you'll see that the sizing difference is maybe a little bit off when I was developing this pattern. That's okay. We're just using this as more of a guide, not so much a really true to life, pixel perfect guide for how we're developing this. And we'll close out this side as well, so that we're going to have something kind of like this. Now, before we get any farther, I want to go ahead and just rename this from plane to rubber, because that's what we're creating, the rubber tread, underscore high. And for now, we're not going to worry about it too much in terms of the explanation, but just make sure that as we're building our high poly, we want to end all of the objects with the suffix underscore high. And we'll look at that later in the series as to why we're doing that. But for right now, just consider that best practice as we're modeling our high poly mesh. So now before we get any further, let's go ahead and add our first modifier. And the reason we're going to do this is it makes it a little bit easier to kind of conceptualize how we're going to be working with this model and what we're going to be doing to really offload a lot of this work. So with this object selected, let's go into the modifiers panel and let's go and add an array modifier. And so what the array modifier does is it creates a bunch of different instances or versions of the model that we've got. And we can go ahead and array it in different directions. If I go and change the original model, it's also going to change the subsequent versions of this model that we've created. And now I want to, instead of relative offset, go ahead and select constant, so that now when I change this, it doesn't actually change the offset of these from the original version. So back in front orthographic, and actually I'll stay in edit mode to make it a little easier to see, and probably even change our viewport shading here to something like red, so it's a little nicer to see. I'm going to change the distance x to 0, and let's go and just bring up the distance z, and actually maybe set the count down to something like 3. So that now as I bring this up, we're going to try and match our little sheet here as best as we can. And this is how we're going to create that simple procedural and dynamic workflow, so that I don't have to go and create all the other versions of this that we'll be modeling and merging together. Blender's going to handle all of that for me, and I'm not going to have to worry about a thing. So now that we have these arrayed versions, let's go and take a look at how we're going to start connecting these pieces here. So we'll take a look, and I'm going to grab this vertex here, and holding down Control and then clicking on this one over here should create a selection of the shortest path. Now if I hit E to extrude on the Z axis, we can see that I'm bringing these vertices upwards, and we can go and get close to our array. Now I don't want to go all the way up, and actually what I want to do is get about halfway. And I want to repeat this process with the bottom loop here, hitting E and extruding downwards. And I want to meet our other loop pretty much halfway down there. Now you'll see that we have a little bit of gap in between these pieces, but we're not going to have to worry about that because the array modifier comes with a very handy option here. So if I go ahead and select merge, hopefully you can see that on your monitor, but those gaps have actually gone away. It's merging the vertices between our arrayed pieces so that it's creating essentially a watertight connection, so that when we apply this modifier, we're not just getting a bunch of overlapping vertices on top of each other. So that's going to be a really, really handy feature. And then what I want to do is just quickly select both of these sides here, hit E to extrude along the Y direction, and these will be the sides of our tire tread once we start to round this out. And now finally, let's go and finish up our very simple model here by creating the extrusions for these pieces. So I'm going to select, go into face selection mode, and making sure I'm selecting only these faces here that are our extrusions. We can go ahead and now extrude these out. And I don't want to go too far with it. I want to keep the tread kind of nice and closely, knit to the tire itself. But if you wanted to, you could go and make these very, very deep tread if you wanted to, depending on the tire that you're going to want to make. But again, it's not going to be a circular shape, much like a tire is. We're still lacking that very fundamental feature of what makes tires tires. So the way we're going to do that is by going ahead, and I'm just going to hide this rubber high for a second. Let's go and create a new object, and we're going to do a curve circle. And this is going to be the guide for how we're going to be doing that. And hopefully you can kind of see the direction I'm going with it, if maybe not the nitty-gritty of how we're getting there. But this is going to be the curve object that we're going to use to influence the bending and the shaping of the tread that we just created. Now it's going to be a little bit small. If we bring this rubber back in, we can see that's very, very tiny and also not the right direction. So I want to make sure in edit mode, and I'll just hide our rubber again, that I'm going to rotate our curve along the y-axis 90 degrees so that it's upright. And if I go into side orthographic by hitting 3 on my numpad, I'm going to make sure that my circle is about 6 to 7 meters tall. So right now we can see that it's 2 meters, right? Because we've got 2 of these squares on either direction. But if I hold down Control and bring this up, so this will be 6, and I think I'll bring it up to, we'll do 7 for now. I might bring it down just a little bit depending on how big the tread is compared to the circle. But this is now going to be a very good guide for how we're going to mold the tread along that circular direction. So if I bring my rubber back in and select it, we're going to need to add another very critical modifier to this object. So under Add Modifiers, under the Deform option, let's go to Curve, and I'm going to select this curve object. So we can see that it's trying its hardest with the information default right now. It's kind of doing what we want, where it's curving this object and deforming it along the curve object, but it's not exactly how we want it. It's not the right direction. So instead what I want to do is change the deform axis to be the Z axis of this guy here. You can see that we've got it oriented in the Z direction, and that's the direction that we're going to need to actually deform it along the curve. So if we switch this from X to Z, now we're going to be able to see that these tire treads are going to start to array around this circle. So hopefully this modeling is making a little bit more sense now as we've been working on it in terms of how we're actually getting to create such a complex asset with such a very, very simple model. So instead of just creating a very, very high count for the array modifier, what we can do is actually switch the fit type from fixed to fit curve. And then what we can do is go and select this curve here. So now if I go and play around with our Bezier circle by scaling this up or down, you can see that the number of treads is going to dynamically change to fit how long this curve actually is. And that's going to be really cool and very easy for us to start to create various sizes of tire treads. And that's why I really love working with Blender's modifier stack in a pretty non-destructive way, because procedurality allows for very flexible workflows, and it just gives us a lot less headaches down the line when we need to go back and maybe change something that fundamentally changes the entire model itself. So now that we have the modifiers set up on our model, I want to use them to better understand and visualize our model as we're modeling it, so that we're still going to get this preview even on top of when we're modeling and doing some of the finer tweaks. So if I go into edit mode, you can see it's going to get rid of our array and our curve, and that's really not useful whatsoever. What's even the point of having these on if we can't see them, right? So what Blender allows us to do is come up to this little button here, and we can see that it's the edit mode, display modifier, and edit mode button. So when I enable this, now I can see this modifier's output even when I'm in edit mode, and I can go ahead and start to tweak our original model, and it's going to still preview the final output of that modifier. Now, array is useful, but in this particular instance, maybe not the most useful. So what I would like to do is to turn on curve. And so we can see now it's getting the output of the array and then the output of the curve. And I could even turn off the array if I just wanted it to be this single piece here. But again, kind of seeing it as a whole is going to be a little bit easier and a little bit nicer. So what I want to do here is I want to start adding some detail to the profile of the tire here, because right now it's very flat and very straight and very not good looking. So what we're going to do is I'm going to add an edge loop on both of these. So I'm hitting Control and R and hovering my mouse over top of these, the bisection, I guess, of the edges here. And I'm going to select both of these. And I'm going to just quickly turn on our wireframe here, turn the opacity down so we can kind of see what's going on. And now if I move this, we can see that it's not changing the profile at all as I'm moving it along the y-axis. However, it is adding edge loop information so that now if I go and scale this on the X, maybe get a more frontal or profile view, again, scaling it on the X, all of a sudden we're starting to get some detail into the sides of this. And actually what I want to do is quickly just come down here and select both of these edges here. And then again, hitting S and X to scale them out so that we're not just getting a straight up on the tire there, and kind of rounding those out just a little bit. It's a very, very subtle detail. But again, it's already helping actually astronomically. So I'm going to just quickly go and add another edge loop. And again, I'm doing this on both sides to try and keep this even and equal so that we're not doing just one side, but actually getting both. And so even very simply, with just pushing out a couple of those edges there, we're able to get something that looks pretty nice. And really the bulk of the modeling that we're doing is just this simple strip down here. So now that we have the base kind of modeling done, let's go and take a look at how we can actually smooth this out and make it look nice. Because right now we only have about 7,000 triangles, which is pretty low for a high poly model, quote unquote. So one way we can do this non-destructively is by adding another modifier, and it's going to be the subdivision surface modifier. And you may have heard of this or have used it before. Chances are if you've used Blender for 2 seconds, you've probably used this modifier. And what it does is it starts to subdivide and smooth the transitions of our geometry. And we can see that we've gone from just a measly 7,000 to a much higher 29,000. And if I increase this level again, well, wow, we've gone for a much, much higher poly count or triangle count. And while it looks kind of nice in some areas, we are losing a lot of that definition in the original shape of our model. And so we have to go back and tweak a little bit of our model first to make sure that this subdivision surface modifier isn't totally just removing that detail. So I'm going to just hide that first. And let's go and just hide both of these, because I can do this in a rather non-destructive way so that we can still retain the edges and the flow of this model. And the way we're going to do that is by adding, you guessed it, another modifier. And this one is going to be the bevel modifier. So I really like to work with the subdivision surface and the bevel modifiers together. They really tend to work well with each other in terms of hard surface assets and in a pretty non-destructive way. Now, what we're going to want to do is make sure that the bevel modifier is going to be above our subdivision surface modifier. And I'm actually going to put it at the very beginning of our modifier stack. And in case you didn't see how I did that, I just grabbed on those 8 little dots there and just click and dragged it all the way up. And now a quick little gotcha in case you're pretty new to Blender is that the way that we stack our modifiers is going to greatly change how the final result is displayed at the end of the day in most instances. So we want to make sure that the order of operations is very clear, where our very first or top modifier is going to be executed first and work its way down our modifier stack. So sometimes if you're getting some weird results with your modifiers, try moving some of your modifiers around and putting them in different spots to see if that really helps with just the calculations that Blender is doing. So now that we have our bevel at the top of our stack, I'm going to go and get rid of this reference so we don't have to see that anymore. And I'm going to go and turn on our wireframe again. And we can see pretty much what's going on by default is it's beveling some of those edges based off of an angle threshold. Now, we don't want to do it based off of an angle. We want to tell Blender specifically which weighted edges we want to bevel. So let's select the weight mode. And I'm also going to change the amount from 0.1 to 0.005. So it's going to be a very, very small amount of beveling, but that's because I want to still retain really the original shapes that we have here. So now how do we go about beveling these edges and telling Blender which ones to bevel, right? Well, I'm going to hit N on my keyboard to bring up the sidebar panel here. And if I select this object and go into edit mode, you'll notice that the transformation area changes under item. And we're going to want to use this bevel weight slider. And by default, Blender hides this very well, actually. So if you can't find it, make sure to just take a look around in the side panel here under item. I really wish it was in a different spot, or even if it was in the modifier itself. But just to make the connection between the slider and the modifier, we can see bevel weight, and the modifier is bevel under the weighted limit method. So that's kind of the connection here. And we'll see that as I go and just select all of these top edges here, and I'll just bring the slider up to 1, we're going to get a blue line to indicate this is a weighted edge. And we'll see that I actually now have a beveled edge here. And if I turn on my subdivision surface modifier, we won't notice much of a difference necessarily, but if I turn this off and on, we can see that it's starting to retain some of the original face shape that we had on the original model. And so that's what we're going to be doing with these weighted bevel normals. So I'm going to do the same thing with all of these top faces here. Just setting that up to 1. I'm also going to take all of these side edges here too and set that up to 1 as well. And if we turn on our subdivision surface modifier here, we can see that the difference we're getting in the profile is pretty significant actually. If we take a look from the top down, it's a lot less rounded and a lot sharper, which if we take a look at an actual tire is kind of the case for the side profile there. I also want to go ahead and select all of these. If I just turn this off, these retaining kind of like corner edges. And we can go ahead and crease those. So if we take a look now, we're starting to retain some of those sides and they're not just kind of like super blobby anymore. However, we're not getting those sharp kind of peaks and valleys on these pieces. So what we can do is also just select the entire edge loop, again holding down Alt and clicking on our edge to create these edge loop selections. And I'll go ahead and just into our view here, take a look at what's going on. And if I bring this up, you can see that we go from no bevel to having a slight bevel and really bringing back those valleys and peaks. Now, if I go and select our array and our curve modifiers here, just to quickly see what's going on our mesh, we're getting a lot of that shape back, but we'll notice if I take a look at the wireframe, we're getting a bit of a messy kind of wireframe here, because we're having a breakup of bevel modifiers going on. If we take a look, and it's creating these little quads kind of in the corners of areas. So if we take a look down here, and I just hide those again, we can see that because we have just this edge going off into not a weighted edge anywhere else, it's creating these small little patches at those corners and a real topology nightmare on our final mesh. So what I'll do is I'm going to select these ones that run off of our end edges over here. And let's just add a weighted bevel there, so that way we're having them go somewhere and not running off and creating those weird kind of quads. So now if we take a look, we're getting a much nicer and smoother topology along those faces. So if I bring back our array and our curve, things are starting to look a lot nicer. The side is starting to look a lot rounded as well, or a lot more rounded, I should say, not a lot rounded. However, you might notice now there's a slight shading error that's going on. And this is because of our initial model again. You can kind of see these like vertical lines that are kind of bisecting the original circle. And if I come into the side profile, you can kind of see a little bit that they're actually very, very like faceted faces, right? And if I go into our wireframe mode, we can kind of see what the issue is going on here, is that we're getting a lot of like creasing in these areas down here. And then it's going to a much nicer flow back into a crease, into a nicer flow, into a crease. So we want to go back to our original model here. And what's going on is that we have, if we take a look, these two vertices here, which is creating that kind of issue. So what I want to do is with this edge selected and only this edge, we don't want these top two here. And actually, I'll just go ahead and get rid of that for the time being. I want to hit X on my keyboard and I want to collapse the edges and faces so that we're getting only one vert down the center. And I'm going to do that for the next three that we have here. You might have a different number, but before we get all the way up to this one here, and collapse that so that we have this line running down, or this edge loop running down halfway through, so that we aren't getting kind of this small edge, big edge, and then small edge again, like we had originally. So now if I turn this modifier back on, you can see that this is a much nicer topology flow than we have over there, where it starts to crease a little bit. Now we're also getting this rounding on the side, which really isn't an issue too much because we do have the array modifier merging all of these top pieces here. But if you ever run into a case where you're having an issue because the subsurface modifier is bending these, what you can do is come into the advanced option, and under the boundary smooth, instead of all, we can hit keep corners. And so that's going to keep these corners here, which is going to allow us to just make it in a nice squared off section. So now I'm going to do the same process over here, selecting all of these edges that we have, hitting X and then collapse edges and faces so that again, we're not getting that very scrunched topology, but much nicer, smooth and consistently spaced topology. And now we're going to get a triangle right there, but we don't have to worry about that. That's really not going to cause us any issues. So now if I come back and make sure that we have all of this in view mode there, we can see that we're not going to get that shading issue anymore. We're going to have some nice solid and hard surface topology. And if we want to, at the end of the day, go ahead and just add a little bit of, or tweak some of the topology of our model here. All we have to do is go ahead, select our initial model, and just start to scale and move these various pieces on our very simple, but yet very complex single model. I'm going to select our model and hit W on my keyboard. You should also be able to just right click if you're a left click select user. And we can go and select Shade Smooth so that we're going to get some smooth shading on this guy. Now I know this has been a pretty long video, but there is one more thing I want to do before we close it out, just to make sure that we are pretty satisfied and complete with this model. And that's going to be right down here in the front. And you've probably noticed it as you've been working, but we're going to get these two kind of intersecting pieces. And this is going to be from our array. If you recall when we were playing around with this curve and it was adding more and less of those arrays dynamically, this is going to be a result of the piece that we've been modeling just being a little bit too large for what the curve wants. And so it starts to kind of, it creates a new array instance when it's kind of intersecting and overlapping with the original piece a little bit. And it's just a circumstance of the original model conflicting with the array modifier. So I'm just going to turn that off for now. And I'm going to turn my wireframe back on. And what I want to do is select our Bezier curve. And the way I like to kind of just fix this is I'm going to scale up our array, or sorry, our curve just a little bit, just so that it's a little bit intersecting with the original piece. So you can see right here, this is our final piece. This is our original piece, and it's arrayed all the way around in this direction. So now that I have this very minuscule overlap, I'm going to go back to our tire here, and I'm going to add a weld modifier. And so what the weld modifier does is it finds vertices that are very close to each other, and it essentially merges them all together so that there's no longer an overlap and it becomes one vertex. And I'm going to do this right above the subdivision surface modifier and right after our curve modifier. Now I want to keep this pretty low, and frankly I really don't want to move it at all if I can help it, because we do have a lot of other vertices that are very close to each other, like the bevels, that we do want to keep. And if I start to bring this up, right, you can see we start to remove all of that. So instead what I want to do is select our Bezier circle, and I'm just going to slowly kind of scale that up and down until I can kind of find that sweet spot. Like that. And now we can see that the overlap is gone because I've moved them close enough that the modifier has picked that up. Now it's a little finicky, and if you wanted to at the end of the day, just instead of trying to finagle with that, go ahead and apply all of these modifiers first, and then by hand go ahead and merge those together. You're more than welcome to. But again, I like to try and make this as non-destructive as possible. And I also wanted to show you just as many modifiers as I possibly could so that you have an idea of what actually exists and what you could use for certain use cases.